So for my presentation, I'm going to be talking about The Fountain Boston by Maurice Prendergast, and this is a watercolor on paper that he did around 1900, and it is part of Kevin and Kennedy's collection, so you may remember seeing it in New York City. It was on view kind of in that first room that you enter their apartment in, adjacent to the bathroom on the wall. So quickly, I just want to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about today. First, I'll give you a brief background on Maurice Prendergast, and then we'll look at a couple of his other works to contextualize The Fountain Boston, and then we'll go more in depth into this work, and then it was actually part of a series. He did 4 other works of the same location, so we'll take a quick look at those to end my presentation. So Prendergast was a member of the 8, and this is a group that we've talked about extensively in class, but essentially this was just a loose formation of artists that were pushing against the academic tradition of art at that time, against the National Academy, and kind of trying to expand what was accepted as art in America during the 20th century. And he exhibited with the 8 at the Macbeth Gallery in 1908, and then he also participated in the 1913 Armory Show. And I thought one funny comment was, I know in class we talked about how Marcel Duchamp's works were criticized, his Nude Descending a Staircase, as an explosion in the shingle factory. His were actually criticized as an explosion in a paint factory, which we'll see because he uses a lot of bright colors, and this was a shock to the art world at this time. And then I know Amanda talked about this a lot in her presentation, but a big part of his process was studying and traveling in Europe. So we saw that through his time he spent in Venice, but he also went to Paris a lot, and he was especially influenced by the artists Cezanne and Matisse, as well as the landscapes in Europe and in New England as well. So this is a work that we saw at Munson Williams, and we talked about for a while with our guide. And I just thought that this work really exemplifies Prendergast's legacy. He is classified as a post-impressionist artist, and a lot of his works use a lot of colors, as you can see in this one. They're very dotted, kind of pointillism-esque, but not quite, and they're often characterized as gem-like because of these flat shapes that tend to kind of sparkle in my eyes. And then he also tried to capture the life and joy around leisure activity, a lot of public spaces. He did a lot in parks. This one is by the coast. So he just tries to use, I guess this is one of his later works, but you can see he uses these warm colors and bright tones to kind of characterize the charm and happiness in this scene. And then these are just a small selection I chose of his work from the collection from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston website, and I just thought it was interesting to look at his earlier work as kind of more similar to the classic Impressionist work before the Modernist movement. It's still drifting into more contemporary works, but then you can see as you go around the timeline, his works start to get more gestural, and they have a bigger emphasis on bright color and especially pattern, I think, as you can see in the last works. And it becomes less about representing the characters specifically, but representing them in the scene and trying to capture the mood through this pattern. And now going back to the Fountain Boston. So this is a painting. You can't actually see the Old West Church, which it's painted in front of. That would be behind the viewer as you're looking at it, but it was painted when the Old West Church in Boston was actually a temporary public library, so it would be normal to see the scene filled with people. And just the first thing that popped out to me in this image was the rhythmic quality, specifically focusing on the fountain in the middle. The way that he uses these different shades of blue to create this broken color really creates the sensation that the water is moving up and down and continuously flowing. And then I also see the same level of detail going into the trees in the background. He uses all of these different shades and tones, and it's kind of hard to see, but you can see like there's even some leaves falling, so you can tell this would be a fall day where there might be some wind blowing and the leaves are falling. And I kind of summarize this painting as a collection of a bunch of details that come together to create a really busy but actually very coherent composition of these people enjoying this public space on a fall day. And there's so many details as a viewer that you can get lost in. Some I want to quickly point out are the fence. I just think his brushwork is very impressive in capturing the metalwork on this fence, and then looking beyond the fence, he does the individual cobblestones, which I think a lot of artists wouldn't spend the time to do. And then I think that these red, it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but these are kind of a very vibrant red, and I think that's an important detail in the foreground, which kind of lifts the color of this otherwise very dark space. And I also think the variation he used in the bricks in the background building was very impressive, because these could easily be forgotten in the background, but he still spends the time to do a lot of variation in the washes. This is a graphite with watercolor, so he outlined some of them with pencil and then filled them in with the washes. And then you can also see this very clearly with the stones there, how he manipulated the mediums to represent them. Honestly, very realistically in this medium, which is very challenging. And I think that both the foreground and the background are very busy, but he does a few things in this painting so that it's not overwhelming. One thing I noticed is, in general, the background of the painting is lighter colors than the front, which means he's still able to use a lot of detail, but it doesn't come forward and overwhelm the front of the composition. I also think that it is, in general, has less contrast than the front. The darkest darks in the back are much lighter than the darks in the foreground of the painting. And also he makes the figures not as defined. You can tell there's a large body of people, but they do not have the same amount of detail as the figures in the foreground. And then just going to how he used the medium to illustrate the figures, I think is really important to look at. He really is able to use the pencil, especially I'm looking at this woman and the girl in the white coat. You can see how he uses the graphite and the watercolor to really capture a great amount of detail in a simplistic way, and especially with the woman's expression too. He uses faint pencil marks, but he really captures the woman's expression. And then one interesting detail that Professor Shapiro and I looked at in the apartment in New York City is this area where you can see that there were two figures that he decided to wash over. And I think this shows that even though this painting is it has a lot to do with the details, it's also about just the overall mood of the scene, because it wasn't important to him that he messed up this area. He just kept going with this painting. And again, it does show the leisure activity, which is common to his works. And then quickly, I just wanted to point out the frame. There are these small details of flowers in the corners, which I think is really interesting, and I think it can be argued either way, that it works with the image or it doesn't. In one way, it does kind of match the way that he did the leaves in the trees, but on the other hand, I do think it's kind of a piece of art in itself, and this could distract from the beauty of the painting. And then finally, this work was in a series that he did in front of the West Church in Boston. So these are 4 other works. One of them is in a private collection, the other one the Metropolitan Museum of Art has, and then there's one at Christie's, and another one at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So I just think it's interesting that he was able to focus on this one area for so long and put such detail into it, which meant he must have had a lot of patience, and it also shows his love for the city of Boston, which is where he spent most of his life.